How's it going, guys? My name is John and welcome to Player Recap. Patch 1.6 of Aether Gazer Global is about to drop, so I figured this was as good a time as any to start refreshing people's memory of the story. I'll be doing a series of short-ish videos covering what happens, but before that, I wanted to make a slightly longer video that introduces some of Aether Gazer's setting. Now, you don't need to know all of this stuff to understand the story, but if you're a lore lover like me, you might find most of it interesting anyway. Let's get into it. About 200 years before the start of the story, back during Earth's 22nd century, there were 10 regions called war zones that were caught up in a global conflict. They tried to bring it to an end by unleashing parasitic nanobots on each other, but this backfired spectacularly. These nanobots, known as Stardust 01, were a bit too good at what they did. They'd infest a victim's body, destroy them from both inside and out, and then use the corpse's heat and decomposing flesh as materials to make more of themselves. What made them so terrifying, besides dismantling you alive in a process that presumably involved a lot of screaming, was that ordinary weaponry didn't work against them. They could also hunt their victims autonomously using neural networks and learn from what they discovered. At some point, when their numbers reached a certain size, they connected to a particular neural network, learned from it, and generated a mind of their own. You can kinda see where this is going. They were intelligent before, but now they were self-aware. Instead of ditching the war and coming up with their own goals though, they chose to follow their original orders, which were to kill whatever they'd been unleashed upon. And unfortunately for everyone on Earth, that happened to be everyone on Earth. Nanobots swept across the planet, slaughtering life indiscriminately and multiplying from the corpses. Mankind had no way to fight back against this endless flood of death, and so began the collapse of human society in what would eventually be known as the Stardust Calamity. With human extinction on the horizon, Earth's nations chose to play nice and work together to find a solution. That solution was Project Gaia. They built an absurdly advanced supercomputer called Gaia 0 that would create and manage a simulation of reality called Gaia. Humanity prepared to ditch their bodies and upload their minds into this new world, where they could continue their lives without fear of being disassembled by nanobots. The supercomputer Gaia 0 itself, also referred to as Gaia for short, would remain in low Earth orbit indefinitely, fueled by solar power. Now, Gaia's virtual world would consist of two parts: the surface layer, where humanity's consciousnesses would eventually reside, and the underlying source layer, where all of the raw data and the processes responsible for generating and repairing the surface layer would be stored. There's technically a third region, a space called the core of Gaia, where Gaia's system core is stored. This can be considered to be Gaia in its truest sense. Everything else stems from this, and if anything were to happen to it, it would be game over. Due to time constraints and concerns about stability, Gaia based its surface layer on Earth in the year 2100 before the outbreak of war. It made 10 regions corresponding to the 10 war zones that had previously been in conflict. These would be known as the Saphira zones and can basically be thought of as separate nations with their own cultures and climates. And when I say separate, I mean separate. None of them are geographically linked to each other. They all exist in spatially isolated regions called planes, and the only way to get between them is using a form of transportation called the photon rail. As of now, we're aware of 6 Saphira zones: Ein Sof, New Hansa, Sashvat, Umorphes, Sasanami, and Shuheng. An important thing to note is that all of them contain a hidden Saphira core, which gathers and transmits data to the core of Gaia. They act like Gaia's eyes and ears, but also reinforce their respective zone structure. If they're seriously damaged, the entire Saphira zone will collapse unless the core is repaired. After making all of these Saphira zones, Gaia then went on to make a group of regions called the Gen Zones, but I'll talk about those later. Project Gaia was completed successfully. Humanity's survivors abandoned their bodies and uploaded their minds, allowing civilization to begin anew. As each consciousness descended into Gaia, they were given an option. They could receive a body, be allocated to a Saphira zone, and start their new lives as they were, or they could forget their pain and trauma and be reborn as a clueless baby through the cycle. Now, what is the cycle? Well, Gaia was set up to work in much the same way as a real world, with humans being subject to birth, aging, sickness, and death. However, their consciousnesses wouldn't disappear upon death. They'd instead have their data moved into the source layer, where their memories would be erased, and then they'd be reborn as a newborn baby in one of the surface layer Saphira zones. If the new arrivals chose to start as they were, they were forbidden from disclosing any pre-Gaia history to future generations. In fact, the old calendar was forgotten, and the new calendar began from 2100, creating the illusion that this world was a direct continuation of Earth as it had been before the war. As a result, as time went by and many cycles occurred, the horrors of the Stardust Calamity were lost to history. The average person eventually had no idea that they were living in a simulation. Life was good, until it wasn't. It's unclear how or when this occurred, but a mysterious infection took root in Gaia's source layer and has since begun to produce bugs. These bugs vary greatly in form, intelligence, and power, but all of them share an innate desire to destroy. They were eventually dubbed Vis Banes. They tear fissures in the source layer, and since the source layer is responsible for generating the surface layer, this leads to quakes and other disasters across the Saphira zones. Vis Banes will also head up to the surface layer to wreak havoc. They're an enormous threat to normal life forms due to the corrosive effects of the Bane energy they wield. Some of their victims are destroyed outright, while others are transformed into new Vis Banes. Either way, human consciousnesses that are corroded by Bane energy are lost forever. They're too degraded for Gaia to give them a new life through the cycle. Since Gaia is a closed system, and there are a limited number of human minds being recycled, each death permanently lowers the total population. The corruption Vis Banes spread and the structural damage they do slowly push the world closer towards destruction. Fortunately, Gaia isn't defenseless. Gaia had already written self-check programs to fix errors in the source layer, but with the emergence of Vis Banes, these weren't enough. To adapt to this new threat, Gaia gave some of these self-check programs physical forms so they could fight Vis Banes in both the source and surface layers. These are the modifiers. They're granted system permissions that let them wield a form of energy called Divine Power, which is antithetical to the Vis Banes' Bane energy. Each modifier also has a weapon called an access key that enhances their powers or gives them new abilities entirely. Some of these are tailor-made for them by Gaia, while others are stumbled upon through luck later on. This is, incidentally, the reason why there are different versions of the same modifiers. You'll notice that the first part of their name is their access key, and it can change if they get a new one. Remember when I briefly mentioned Gaia created gen zones? Well, this is where they come in. They're regions where modifiers are born. Like the Saphira zones, the gen zones exist in their own spatially isolated planes, but unlike the Saphira zones, they aren't reachable by the photon rail. Their environments, inhabitants, and even the modifiers they produce are all based on the myths of the old world. We currently know of 6 gen zones: Yggdrasil, which is based on Norse and Celtic mythology, Shino, which is based on Japanese Shinto mythology, Nile on Egyptian mythology, Olympus on Greek mythology, Tian Yuan on Chinese mythology, and finally Asterism, which is a mixed bag containing everything from Judeo-Christian to Indic mythology. Modifiers are born in their respective gen zones in a state called a functor. They start out as clueless, sleeping infants who are waiting for a day where their true name is called to awaken into their true forms. While they're in this stage, they're more akin to a spirit that hasn't fully taken shape yet than a physical being, and it's possible for structural damage to Gaia to make them fall out of their gen zone. If this happens, they will fail to become a modifier. They may instead end up inhabiting a physical object somewhere on the surface layer. When these kinds of functors are combined with a modifier's access key, they can enhance its power. Now on the other hand, if nothing disturbs the functor's gen zone and their name is successfully called, they take on a corporeal form and are sent to the surface layer. This is known as their arrival day. They know absolutely nothing, and their powers and any access keys Gaia created for them are dormant. It's kind of messed up how Gaia just throws kids out into the world to fend for themselves, but whatever, I guess. Some are lucky enough to be adopted by loving families, while others have to find their own way to survive. This isn't necessarily as difficult as it sounds though, as even modifiers with dormant powers appear to have physical abilities far greater than ordinary humans. Examples include the modifier Sobek, who grew up as a wild child and was able to fight off a pack of wolves, and Athena, who could overpower fully grown knights of Convallaria. Despite all of this, most mistakenly believe that they're human until at some point during their life they awaken. In this moment, they're suffused with divine power and their bodies stop aging forever. If they were granted access keys, these awaken too. They will usually, but not always, gain an intuitive understanding of their purpose, which is to hunt Vis Banes to prevent the end of the world. The modifier Vathandi described it as, "Like I was remembering something from a past life." Those who don't gain this information may mistakenly believe they simply have superpowers. Either way, modifiers are not always willing to drop what they're doing to dedicate their lives to a new cause when they learn the truth. However, many are. The best example of this are the members of Aether Gazer. Aether Gazer is an organization established by the mysterious modifier Odin. Her goal was to gather others like her and train them up, allowing them to protect future modifiers and conduct research on Vis Banes. In order to shield their identities, she founded a multi-industry investment company that she also named Aether Gazer. This would allow them to operate in human society while posing as the company's employees. Aether Gazer's modifiers are all gathered within the company's most secretive department, Division 9. Its real name is Vis Banes General Command. Odin is technically the supervisor, but all of the work falls into the lap of Director Shu, who's the de facto leader while Odin is away being mysterious. There are several groups under Division 9, but the three most relevant are the Cryptics, the Special Task Force, and the General Office. The Cryptics are responsible for providing technical support, improving access keys, and inventing new technology. They're behind things like the Mimir system, which can do everything from detecting newly awakened modifiers by the divine power to assisting modifiers in battle. The Special Task Force is made of various named squads who head out to accomplish missions. Then there's the General Office, which is where you come in. In the game, you play as the Administrator, the only human in Division 9. Your job is a mix of supporting modifiers in battle and administrative duties like signing off proposals. Your backstory is only briefly alluded to in the early chapters, but in Verthandi's Heartlink story, it's explained how you joined Aether Gazer. One day, you saw a stalker following a girl into an alleyway and tried to help her. The girl turned out to be the modifier Verthandi, and the stalker turned out to be a Vis Bane in disguise. You pushed Verthandi out of the way of an attack and were dragged into the Source Layer in her place. Aether Gazer was able to rescue you, but not before you were seriously wounded. While this should have been a death sentence given the destructive nature of Bane energy, you were able to live following some surgery. You suffered from amnesia, but physically you healed with no trace of your injuries. This is especially shocking because you are the only human who has ever survived that level of corrosion. You aren't out of the woods though. The attack left some kind of mark inside you, and as long as it remains, Vis Banes will always continue to hunt you. Unfortunately, since there's no precedent for this, Aether Gazer has no idea how to remove it. They did, however, discover that being around modifiers can dim its effects, so your best bet at surviving is to stay at Aether Gazer HQ or around its modifiers until a solution is found. While you were working out what to do next, Shu had an idea due to some tests they ran back during your surgery. She got you to try the Mimir system in a training session with Verthandi. Her hunch paid off. You reached a shocking 80% synchronization rate on your first try, and were able to enter a special state called Zero Time. Your analysis and the boost you gave Verthandi using the system helped her win her mock battle with ease. She even showed signs of using a technique she hadn't been able to master called Modified Mode. What makes all of this such a big deal is that the strain of connecting a mind to the Mimir system is notoriously hard on its user. In fact, it's so strenuous that its creator, Heimdall, had to build an AI codenamed Mimir that could learn how to use it safely. Even Odin herself couldn't handle it for long. However, you can use it without experiencing any side effects. This makes you an invaluable asset on the battlefield. After you agreed to join Aether Gazer, influenced by Verthandi's aspirations, Shu hired you as an official employee. She created a new position entirely and appointed you as Aether Gazer's Division 9's administrator. Since all colleagues have to pass examinations, you were given a month to study. You passed and successfully took the role. And that's where you are at the very start of the story. Since I talked about the Mimir system, I may as well touch on the AI floating cat machine things called meows. I mentioned that Heimdall built an AI called Mimir. It works as an intermediary because most people can't handle linking their minds to the Mimir system. Well, Heimdall made more. While Mimir still has the greatest processing power, its personality is flawed. Heimdall made a mistake on its AI growth map, and so it can be pretty troublesome to deal with. The other meows aren't as capable, but they generally have more helpful dispositions and specialize in using the Mimir system to handle specific tasks. These can range from managing logistics to recording experimental data to reconnaissance, and so on. The swigs the game treats as stamina are actually coolant used to cool down meows when they heat up from the load of using the Mimir system. They're named after the noise Mimir makes when he's drinking them. Now there are two important concepts I still haven't touched on yet. Ideal build and the deviation rate. In order for humanity to live better lives, Gaia makes real-time calculations in an attempt to find a path that will guarantee the most stable development of human civilization. This perfect trajectory is called the Ideal Build World Line. The World Line is used by Gaia to assess its stability, and so the further events break away from this, the higher Gaia's deviation rate is considered to be. Since it's impossible to control humanity perfectly, Gaia allows for a little deviation, but extreme deviation is evidence of a crisis. Should the deviation rate ever reach a certain threshold where the destruction of human civilization can't be stopped, Gaia will initiate a forced reboot which will return the source layer, the surface layer, and all human entities back to their initial state. It's unclear if this has ever happened, and even if it did, it would not restore humans who have been corroded out of existence by Vis Banes. One thing worth knowing is that Gaia's calculations involve extremely detailed models of potential futures. Aether Gazer often takes action to prevent the worst of these outcomes from ever occurring. When any calculated future is successfully cancelled out, the enormous data cache associated with it will collapse and form into a data crystal called a shifting flower. The Mimesis system can absorb and analyze these to upgrade itself. These shifting flowers aren't stable and can shatter into smaller crystals called shifted stars. However, even a single shifted star can reflect an entire alternate future and can still be absorbed to enhance the Mimesis system's computing power. That process of absorption is easier said than done though. It requires someone to link themselves to the Mimesis system and actually dive into this future so that the system can analyze things while they're there. The administrator is the only person who can maintain a stable connection with the Mimesis system long enough to collect data in this way. That's why the Causality Survey game mode involves you entering into these strange scenarios. They're actually crapsack futures Aether Gazer prevented from happening, where everything went wrong. So basically, when you use shifting flowers or shifted stars to buy things, you're technically spending futures that never came to be. Anyway, that's about it. That's basically everything you need to know and some stuff you don't need to know about Aether Gazer's setting to get into this story. I hope this was helpful and that it puts a few of the terms you've heard thrown around into context. Next up will be the actual story summaries, which should be considerably shorter. Probably. Thanks for watching and catch you later.